Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Here's something a little bit unusual for you. You're looking at the footage in the background and you're saying, wow, Titan XPs sure are great graphics cards. Look at that texture quality. And I'd be saying, that's actually real, but never mind, I can understand the mistake. So, a few years ago, we were in Vegas, which is a magical place, our favorite place on Earth, and we happened to come across a gun range. And I wanted to shoot some machine guns, because I hadn't really had the opportunity to do that. So we partnered up with a company called Battlefield Vegas to produce a video for Jenna's channel, which showed some incredibly novice shooting from me. I am awful when it comes to guns, don't even ask. And before you ask, by the way, no, I'm not left-handed. I just have this weird problem with my right eye where I can't see through sights correctly. So I do actually use all my guns on the left, which is a bit weird and probably why I don't hit anything. However, we were back in Vegas quite recently, and Battlefield Vegas sprang to mind. I had a great experience there, and I thought to myself, I wonder what they've got when it came to World War I. A few years before, we saw them restoring a Vickers gun, the British machine gun from World War I. So I asked them, and I said, hey, we've been playing Battlefield 1 recently, and I'm sure that people would love to see some real guns fired from Battlefield 1, and we'll talk a little bit about the history, and also talk about just how accurate Battlefield 1 truly is when compared to the real deal. And as it turns out, they actually have quite the selection. So what I decided to do was go, film it, fire a few of these weapons, give you a little bit of a report, but honestly, my historical gun knowledge is a little lacking, I have to say. Thankfully, there is somebody on YouTube who does not have that problem. We've been looking to collab together for quite some time, but our spheres of content generally don't overlap. They do this time, however. His name is Ian, and he's from ForgottenWeapons.com. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your channel before we start here, because I believe you did actually help a little bit with the development of Battlefield 1.
I did a very slight way, just the minimum amount required to get into the credits at the end, I think. But the channel I run, Forgotten Weapons, is basically a nerdy celebration of all guns that are less than common. So I do a lot of prototypes, a lot of experimental guns. The weirdest and most interesting stuff I can get my hands on. So when Battlefield 1 was looking for some more exciting guns to use in the game rather than the things that were most commonly actually used in World War I, they found a lot of that sort of stuff on my website and channel. So a lot of semi-autos, some prototype stuff, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so if you want to blame anybody for the prevalence of SMGs and automatic weapons in that game, it's his fault. Absolutely, all 100%
Oh, that's harsh.
No. But do head over to his channel and to his website if you want to see some very unusual weapons, and quite a few of those unusual weapons do appear in video games as well. If you want to see the actual jackhammer shotgun, yes, that did exist in some form. I believe you're one of the only channels to have actually got a hands on the real one.
Yes, well, there is only one real one. So.
Indeed. The rest of them, I believe they destroyed them in testing, or were just models, if I recall correctly.
There were only 3 functional ones ever built, and yeah, the other 2 were both destroyed in testing.
That is a shame. Thankfully, it does live on in games such as Max Payne, if I recall correctly. But today we're going to be playing around with some stuff that's an awful lot older than that. This is some of the more common weapons that were used in World War I, as opposed to some of the more exotic. We do have 1 or 2 that were not seen very often, and you will get to see that later. We're going to start with some handguns, make our way through some of the commonly issued bolt actions. We do have a submachine gun, and you're going to get to see that, despite the repeated claims that SMGs were not commonly used in World War I, which is true, but we did manage to get a hold of one anyway. And, of course, the light machine gun, some of the stuff that you will remember. We will not be running around with any of those, certainly not. They're a lot heavier than they look, but we're going to talk a little bit through the way that they handle, the history of the weapon, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll know a little bit more about some of the more commonly used weapons from Battlefield 1. So let's start with one of the most iconic pistols from that era. Not only that era, but of course used in plenty of World War II media as well, and that is the Luger P08.
Yeah, very cool, and as you say, very iconic. It's one of those pistols people would recognize even today. A lot of, not gun people will recognize the Luger as an iconic handgun.
Absolutely. Aesthetically, it is a beautiful piece of engineering, and there's no doubt about that. but the thing that most people will recognize it for is the unusual lever to the top of the weapon. Can you explain exactly what the purpose of that is?
Yeah, one of the cool things about the Luger is it really is one of the very first automatic pistols designed, or rather, it's the stepson of one of the very first ones. So it retains this unusual locking mechanism that people would later realize was really more complex and expensive than you actually needed. But basically, it's something we would refer to as a toggle lock combined with a short recoil mechanism. So in layman's terms, what that means is when you fire, the whole top of the pistol moves backward about a quarter inch, just a couple millimeters. And what's holding the bolt shut during that time is a toggle joint. So if you think about it like a knee or an elbow joint, it's a mechanical setup where when it's straight and flat, you can put a lot of force on it and it won't bend. But once it starts to bend, you get something else that gives it a little push to start bending, and then it very easily collapses in on itself, like your knee or elbow. And that's exactly how the Luger works. When the barrel and the bolt assembly are move fully backwards, the little round toggles on the side of the joint there hit a sloped surface at the back of the frame, and that causes the toggle to break open slightly, and then the recoil and residual energy of the firing actually causes it to fully cycle, kick out the empty cartridge, and load a new one.
Now, you mentioned it was something of the stepson of the first automatic pistol. I believe that was the C93 that you were referring to there.
Yes, the C93 Borchardt, which is generally and correctly considered the first commercially successful self-loading or semi-automatic pistol, designed by a guy named Hugo Borchardt, who thought his gun was the be-all and end-all of automatic pistols. It really wasn't.
No.
Had this weird, like, bulbous growth thing on the back behind the grip, which housed the mainspring. And he didn't see any problem with that, but in reality, it was an awkward gun to handle. It was actually much better as a carbine when you stuck a little shoulder stock on it, better that way than as a standalone pistol. But the company that was manufacturing it for him, WW1, they tried to get him to update it and improve it, and he just wasn't interested. So eventually they ran out of patience, and they had the rights, the license to do the manufacture, and they turned this over to an engineer under their employ by the name of Georg Luger, and he took it and turned it into the P08 Luger. The short version is. So Luger was not a guy who did much inventing of his own, but he was fantastically talented at taking an existing idea and improving it. And so, yeah, he took this very awkward C93 Borchardt and turned it into a famous and iconic Luger pistol.
Both the Luger and the C93 are pistols that are available in Battlefield 1. They both have got slightly different characteristics, but the C93, while it was issued to a limited extent, was nothing compared to the widespread nature and adaptation of the Luger. I mean, there's so much use of this thing. It was manufactured for many, many years. It was produced until 1942, into the middle of the Second World War, and I believe that there were attempts to replace it by the German army, but it was a very popular design, and there was a very if it ain't broke, don't fix it sort of attitude.
To a large extent, yeah. The Luger was not replaced because of any mechanical deficiency. It was replaced because it was simply way more expensive than pistols had to be by the 1930s. So by the late 1930s, the German army was running trials to find its replacement, but they had so many already produced and they had production already set up and running, so there was no reason to just throw them away. As a result, they saw extensive service in World War II, side by side with the P08, which would replace them.
Yeah, that's a common military purchase doctrine that exists to this very day. There are some very cool and interesting, even modern weapon designs that we simply don't see fielded in favor of older stuff because of cost, and because, well, you're developing an entirely new weapon and entirely new platform versus using what you already have, especially with large stockpiles. So that is very, very common. Now, you're talking about the mechanical complexity of the P08. I have to ask, when it comes to that complexity, were there actually any advantages to it, as opposed to it simply being something that added to the price tag?
I would say no. The advantage was that in 1900, when the gun was first developed, in 1908, when it was adopted by the German military, people didn't really have the experience to recognize what the cheap and simple and easy ways to manufacture a functional automatic pistol were. So instead, they had more expensive and more complex ways, resulting in guns like the Luger. Later on, once you have cheaper options that work just as well, there really isn't any advantage to a gun being more complex in a military's perspective. From someone who is an enthusiast or a collector, sure, more complex stuff is really neat and interesting, but military is not interested in neat and interesting. They're interested in effective and affordable.
Yep. Reliability.
Not to jump ahead too much, but that actually really gets at the question of, I think a lot of people are going to ask about, all the interesting prototype semi-auto rifles that are in Battlefield 1. Well, if these things were around, why didn't anybody use them? And the answer, in large part, is because they were ridiculously expensive, and they didn't necessarily work all that well at the time. So people would rather stick with the known, maybe it was less capable, but we knew it would work, and we knew how to make it, and it was easy to get, and that's better than risking development of something brand new.
Yeah. Things that didn't break all the time in an environment like the trenches are also fairly vital. And what you can do on a range with a weapon is a world apart from what happens when you drop it in the mud, or when it's raining very heavily, or when dirt gets inside it. And the more mechanically complex a weapon, the worse it tends to work in those situations.
Yep, exactly.
Now, let's move on to something that people know, perhaps, from a different form of media. The weird thing about this gun, despite it being incredibly ubiquitous, it was issued to a great number of people, is actually not its use in the war, but its use in a different war entirely. Star Wars, the blaster for Han Solo was actually a slightly modified version of this weapon, which is, of course, none other than the Mauser broom handle, as it was called.
Yep. By the way, a name unique to the United States. In Germany, they don't call this a broom handle, and if you do, they kind of look at you weird and aren't entirely sure what you're talking about.
I imagine that would be true, yes. The C96 was its designation, the broom handle being a sort of English name for it, and there's a Chinese name for it too, a nickname, the box cannon,
right,
for this particular gun.
Yep, these were very popular in China in the 1920s and 30s.
They were popular sort of across the board, and you'll probably still find them in paramilitary use to this very day. They were manufactured until 1961, and they actually entered service in the 1900s. Incredibly old gun.
Yeah. Famous anecdote about Winston Churchill actually carrying one as a war correspondent in the Boer War.
That is a long, long time ago.
Yes.
Now, one of the interesting features about this is that you often see it with a large wooden stock. We actually do have it in the footage right here, and the stock doubles as a holster. It slides in there nice and easily and can be carried around inside this weird-looking wooden box.
Yes, indeed. That was actually kind of a common thing for automatic pistols at that time. While the C96 broom handle Mauser is the most common of them, that was something that was offered as an option both commercially and militarily on a lot of other early automatic pistols. A number of different types of Lugers were issued with stocks, as well as some of the other pistols. In fact, the FN 1903 is in Battlefield 1. That was also a gun that you could get from FN with a shoulder stock that doubled as a holster. So, and a lot of other guns as well. They weren't typically used by the military, with the C96 kind of being the notable exception. But they do definitely make the gun easier to shoot effectively than just trying to hold it in the hand.
Yeah, and that is actually represented in Battlefield 1 as well. If you play the tanker class, you will use something that looks very similar to this, which is the carbine version of the C96. Now, the carbine did exist, that was a real thing, and it had it was very slightly different to just taking the pistol and putting it on a stock.
Right. So there are two differences really between the carbine and the stocked pistol. And as you say, yes, the carbines were far less common. The carbines were never adopted by any military force. They were primarily expensive sporting guns. And what they offered was a longer barrel, typically something like 12 inches instead of 4 to 6. And the frame, the grip of the gun was built basically into a shoulder stock. So with the pistol itself, you're attaching a stock to it, and you can take that off and just use it like a pistol. The carbine versions, the stock was sometimes a permanent attachment, sometimes removable, but when you removed the stock, you were not left with any sort of grip to hold on to the gun. The idea was you would take the stock off so that you could pack it into a nice little case to go travel on the train to wherever you happen to be shooting.
I did get a chance to use the stock, and I found as a novice shooter, it does make the gun significantly easier to handle, so I could certainly see why it would be popular with sports shooters at the time, especially those of them that didn't really know what they were doing. The 96 compared to the Luger was more difficult to handle. I think it probably has something to do with the weight distribution, and I believe it was chambered in a number of different calibers. It was chambered in the 9x19 millimeter Parabellum.
Yep.
But you could also chamber it in things like 45 ACP, and there was that. Tell me a little bit about the 7.63-25. That's a caliber that a lot of people don't really know about.
Yeah, 7.63 Mauser was the original standard chambering for this pistol, for the C96, and it's what the majority of them were actually manufactured in. They were made and also retrofitted into 9x19, primarily because 9x19 was the standard German Army pistol cartridge. Interestingly, that 9x19 was originally actually introduced with the Luger. That was a German Army request for something a little more potent than what the original Lugers were manufactured in, and so they came up with this 9x19, and it became popular enough that it's exactly the same cartridge that we still have today as the standard 9mm that everybody goes out and buys for pistols.
Absolutely.
The 45 caliber version was something done uniquely in China because there were some nationalist Chinese military forces that were using 45 ACP as a standard thing. They did that in the late 1920s, and quite rare. There are some in the U.S. that were made as reproductions later on, but the original Chinese ones are really scarce and huge.
I imagine they would be, yes. That is something of a bigger round, and we'll be going on to a pistol that certainly did fire that a little bit later. But in terms of the way that it handles, both the Luger and the Mauser handle in-game in a relatively similar fashion to what they would in real life, assuming that you had a decent amount of skill with them. This was my first time shooting a handgun. Weirdly enough, that my first experience shooting a gun was actually a fully automatic, as opposed to a pistol. But handguns in particular, it's almost like, well, where do I put my hands, and is this thing going to kick up so hard that it escapes? And there is a specific way to grip it. You get to see that in the video quite a bit as my instructor repeatedly adjusts my hands so I don't, well, blow them off or drop the gun or whatever. But pistols in games are often treated as something that is relatively easy to shoot, but obviously in the hands of an experienced shooter, that would certainly be true. The recoil on the C96 I found slightly more difficult to handle than the Luger. It may just be due to the weight distribution of the thing.
It's largely the bore axis. In the Luger, your hand, if you hold the gun one-handed and hold it straight out in front of you, the line of the barrel is pretty darn close to the line of your arm. And what that means is the recoil tends to come straight back, and it's easy to control. With the Mauser, the line of the bore is quite a bit higher than the line of your arm. And that tends to make the pistol buck upwards and backwards much more so. So yeah, the broom handle Mauser is a really kind of awkward gun to shoot. One of the reasons that the Luger has become so iconic is it's an incredibly comfortable gun to handle and to shoot.
Yeah, it's an ergonomic masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. It's a beautiful weapon in and of itself to look at. There's one little bit of a weird feature about the C96 in the sense that it was commonly loaded via a stripper clip as opposed to a magazine, and let's not confuse the two terms. A clip and a magazine are certainly not the same thing.
Yeah, there were some versions of the C96 that did use detachable box magazines, but they didn't come until the 1930s. It was in pretty much all of its general use, it was a gun loaded by stripper clip. And one of my quibbles with not just Battlefield, but almost every video game that includes a gun like this is those things are way more of a pain to load than they look like in the game. It is finicky and obnoxious to clip load, especially a C96.
Yeah, and there were a number of reasons why the stripper clip was used for a while. You mentioned, for instance, that as a cost factor, constructing a stripper clip doesn't cost as much as a magazine.
Right.
Less of a potential failure point, especially in guns that are being used in muddy environments. Earlier magazines had a tendency of getting dirt in them and breaking and all sorts of things like that. But They did eventually stop using them. Of course, we saw a little bit of use in World War II, the M1 Garand probably being the most iconic weapon that still used a stripper clip, but they eventually moved out towards full magazines for everything.
Right, but not in World War I.
No, absolutely not. And a lot of that was down to stripper clips had limited ammo capacity, but that wasn't really a problem in most of World War I guns because they were never really designed for large ammo capacity in the first place.
Right, 5 to 10 rounds was pretty much what you got in pretty much everything.
Absolutely. So that is the Mauser C96 or broom handle. Moving on to perhaps one of the most iconic weapons in the world, and there are plenty of reasons for that, especially when it comes to video games. This is a ridiculously common weapon, simply because it is an old gun, a very old gun, but it's still in active service to this very day, and that is, of course, none other than the 1911.
Yep. Now, of course, I know people are going to point out, so I'll beat them to it, that what you're shooting here is not technically a 1911. It is technically a 1911 A1, which is the result of some updates done by the U.S. military in the 1920s, but they're all pretty much aesthetic changes. There's nothing really mechanically different about the gun. So, yeah, the 1911 was one of the best pistols available in World War I. The Luger would have been hot on its heels, or maybe even in front of it, depending on your perspective. But 1911 is another one of those ones that was really, it was good enough that it's still in widespread use today.
Yes, absolutely. It is an iconic weapon. The design in particular was massively influential when it came to future handgun design.
Yep. John Browning, who designed the 1911, was the guy who invented the concept of a pistol slide, as we have it on virtually every handgun today.
Which is the reason, I suppose, why we don't have more guns that look like the Luger these days, with the whole toggle lock thing. Instead, we have that, big slide on the top, and that's how the next round in the the next round is chambered, simply due to the forces of that being forced back by the recoil, and then the next round sort of being forced in via the magazine.
Yep, much simpler, much cheaper, and easier to manufacture.
Which is why you see it as commonly as you do. And it was a standard issue sidearm for the US military's involvement in World War I, which certainly happened. Some people, for some reason, don't believe they're involved at all. They definitely were. They absolutely were.
Yep.
Even before they officially claimed they were. There were plenty of brave volunteers that headed over, and that is something that is addressed in Battlefield 1, thankfully. For instance, the Harlem Hellfighters are featured quite prominently there. But this weapon was issued pretty much across the board. There were a ludicrous number of them procured. They're still used in the modern military. They haven't been completely phased out. They're still so good, and that some troops do choose to use them, and of course they're often used by police forces as well. Why exactly is it that this gun has stuck around as long as it has?
Part is that it's a very good design, and part of it is nostalgia, and part of it is the U.S. military use. So the U.S. military was using these things for many decades, and that means that the gun itself was perfected in a way that nothing short of 50 years of constant military tweaking will do. And then, of course, the parts became ubiquitous, easy to get, a lot of parts out there to customize and modify the guns, and all of those things tend to keep a pistol in common usage.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the caliber of this thing, because up to this point, we've been talking very much about, 9mm parabellum rounds and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
This uses 45 ACP. Now, some people, including myself, honestly, might be kind of confused about the caliber system and the reasons as to why certain guns would use certain calibers, particularly when we see some referred to by, say, a millimeter, whereas others referred to as what is .45 or .50 or whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about the 45 ACP cartridge compared to the 9mm?
In the broadest sense, the 45 is a bigger, heavier bullet that is traveling slower. You could, if you wanted to kind of blur the lines and generalize a bit, you could say the 45 is twice the bullet at half the velocity, or that the 9mm is half the bullet at twice the velocity. And those are roughly accurate. The reason that the U.S. had it was simply that the U.S. military had decided that they had decided that a bigger bullet was more effective, where other countries decided that a smaller bullet going faster was more effective. And there were various tests done to back up these ideas. In the US, there were a series of tests done shooting both dead and live, but anesthetized livestock. Not necessarily scientifically rigorous by today's standards, but the conclusion was we want something a little bit bigger. The U.S. had a conflict in the Philippines at the very end of the 1800s, where they had a bunch of old .38 Smith & Wesson revolvers that were deemed insufficiently powerful to stop Filipino troops or Filipino guerrillas, and they brought back out the old .45 caliber revolvers, and the memory of that stuck around when they were adopting a new automatic pistol. And so the U.S. military specified that it only wanted a .45 caliber gun. Now, the earliest versions of the 1911, which would have been the Colt 1900 pistols and also the 1902s, did actually use a .38 caliber cartridge, 38 being the same as 9mm. Not the same cartridge, but the same diameter. So that was eventually upgraded or changed to .45, and we ended up with the 1911.
Now, when it comes to shooting this thing, this is something that, compared to its video game usage, is, to me, as a novice shooter, a bit harder to shoot because you are using a bigger bullet, and you feel that. There's no doubt. I think that it takes a little bit more practice to get used to the kind of recoil that something like this can bring to the table, and more often than not, when this weapon is represented in video games, it's not represented in a way that is as powerful as the real version actually is. Okay.
I will agree with you that it does have more felt recoil to it. How that's handled in video games, I'm not the right person to ask. You are.
Yeah, it's such a... the interesting thing about this weapon, in that it's so common that it's used in so many video games, that sometimes there's a bit of a kind of consensus as to what a particular gun should do, and that's based on what it's done in previous games or what role it's filled in the overall balance of the actual thing. Whereas you see stuff like, let's say, a .44 Magnum or a .50 caliber Desert Eagle, they'll be used in a video game, and immediately a gamer will expect, this is the power pistol. This is the one that is ludicrously powerful. This is the one where I'm going to get a one-shot headshot, or I'm going to do serious damage. And there's going to be associated recoil or limits to fire speed in there. But the 1911, obviously not firing as big a round, still firing a bigger round than most, is often handled in a way that feels more like shooting a semi-automatic 9mm. And the damage often reflects that. And it's more of a choice based on, as you mentioned earlier, kind of nostalgia and aesthetics, particularly in the more modern video games when it comes to setting, than saying, hey, actually, this is a pretty damn powerful gun.
Okay. You know, it's interesting to point out there was only one other major military country that had the same caliber attitude as the U.S., and that was the United Kingdom, the British, who also decided to go with a .45 caliber pistol. So theirs was the .455 Webley, which was that cartridge in various forms was used in both semi-auto pistols and revolvers.
Yeah, the Webley revolver being something available in Battlefield 1, and that's something that definitely represents its power. There's the good old mantra for video game design is, if it's a revolver and it's alongside semi-automatic weapons, then the revolver is more powerful because it's slower fire rate and often slower to reload. So that's the kind of compromise that you make. In the case of the Webley, that is at least accurate because it did have a very, very big bullet in it indeed. But yes, sometimes...
Yeah, the Webley was actually slightly less powerful than the .45 automatic.
Well, there you go. Which definitely is not represented well in games. It's entirely the opposite. But of course, that's balance for you. You know, they have to do something to distinguish the weapons. But just bear in mind, if you ever do pick up a 1911 and decide to fire it, you may find it's got a bit more kick than it does in many video game representations. But it is a nice gun to shoot regardless. You know, aesthetically and ergonomically, it was not difficult. It's a bit of a beast. You know, it likes to try and get away from you if you don't treat it with the proper respect. Those are the pistols, folks. There were, of course, quite a few other pistols used in World War I, but these are the most readily accessible and the ones that we had available on the range. So now let's move on to probably the thing which is represented the least well in Battlefield 1, simply because of the way that they have decided to apportion out the weapons in that game. And this is, of course, a series of bolt-action standard-issue rifles, which were, for the most part, the standard weapon of all of the military factions in that war.
Absolutely. It makes me sad how they were used in the game.
Yes, that is my biggest gripe with it. It's also a very common gripe amongst the player base. There have been pushes to make the bolt actions available cross-class. As it stands, the way that the multiplayer works, the only faction with a available bolt action, the only class, is the sniper.
Right.
And they have a ton of different options for bolt actions, and yet none of the other classes have the ability to equip as standard a bolt action, despite the fact that they would have almost all had them.
Right.
Now, the 3 weapons that we have to shoot today are some of the more standard issue bolt actions. There were plenty of different ones, and many of them were, of course, of different ages as well. We have the Springfield M1903. We have the Model 88 Gewehr, and we also have the Enfield No. 1 Mark III. All of these represented in Battlefield as well.
Yep.
Let's start with the Springfield, shall we? That's probably the one that people are most familiar with.
Okay. One thing that people are going to point out is that the gun you have here is actually a World War II gun. It's a 1903 A3 Springfield. The difference being this has an aperture sight on the back of the receiver instead of having a tangent notch sight on the front of the receiver. The U.S. military used this gun in World War I and World War II, and they made that improvement to it before World War II. So the version you'd actually have in World War I would be a little bit different, but other than sights, it would behave the same.
So the M1903 Springfield was the standard issue service weapon I believe for the U.S. military entirely through the course of World War I. Is that correct?
It was one of 2. The U.S. also used the model of 1917 Enfield, which, despite being called an Enfield, is very similar mechanically to the Springfield. And they used both.
It was an incredibly reliable weapon. It was a bolt action, and it was chambered in something of fairly large size, as you've probably seen it in the footage that we have in the background right here. With the bolt action weapons, considering that you're not dealing with semi-automatic fire, you can have a bigger bullet, and the recoil is not as important. It's not a bigger consideration.
Well, sure. You don't have anything particularly fragile that's moving and operating based off the gas pressure of the cartridge. All you have to do is make sure that it locks safely, and then nothing happens until after the bullet is fired and the user is actually ready to cycle the action. So, yeah, all of the standard rifles of World War I used pretty heavy-duty, potent cartridges.
If I recall correctly, that was relatively standard military doctrine at the time, and something that did change a little bit later. Is that correct when it comes to just the size of the bullet and the power available?
Yeah, cartridge size would come down a bit during the Cold War, really, after World War II. But for World War I, what they were looking at is they wanted maximum effective range. And you look at the sights on a typical World War I rifle, and you'll see them go out to 1,500 or 2,000 meters, sometimes even more. And you look at that and you're like, this is absurd, the idea that you can't even see a person at that sort of range. Well, oftentimes what this would actually be used for is something called volley fire, where you would get a large group of men, a whole platoon or even a whole company, all firing at the same very long range, and you're not looking for individual accuracy. You're looking for a spread of bullets over a specific area. Now, you may be able to see that there's a group of enemy soldiers massing in that field 1,200 yards that way. And if you have enough guys to all put fire on that field, you can force the enemy to abandon it.
Was that a doctrine that really kind of came around the musket era? Was it derived from that notion?
I would say probably. I can't point to any specific sources off the top of my head, but yes, with early, especially unrifled firearms, the only way you could get effective fire was to have multiple men firing simultaneously. And that translated over, just you were able to make it a much farther away target.
Now, the way that this is used in Battlefield is where a lot of the inaccuracy starts to come in, because the 1903, along with most of the bolt actions in the game, are used as marksman's weapons as part of the sniper class. Now, yeah, sure, that marksmans did exist. However, the majority of these guns are used with fairly large and long-range scopes, which I would love to know, like, how widespread was scope use in World War I exactly?
Not very. Everyone in the war had snipers, but not in particularly large numbers. And the scope, I hate to say it, the scopes in Battlefield 1 are all wrong. They're pretty much all actual World War I scopes, but they've just kind of been randomly assembled onto different guns where they might look the most interesting, in such a way that you don't really have accurate, or authentic combinations anymore. But yeah, scoped rifles were used, but it was a specialty sort of thing. The idea that you'd have a scout with a sniper rifle is something that's, I think, more a modern thing than it would have been in World War I. Your snipers in World War I were not going to be going forward of the lines, scouting, so to speak. They would typically actually be behind the lines or in the trenches. And there was a lot of emphasis placed on camouflage and hiding, because if the enemy was able to spot you as a sniper, they are going to call down the wrath of God upon you with every bit of ordnance at their disposal. People didn't really like being targeted by snipers.
No, I can't imagine they did. It's a weird inconsistency, not only historically, but the Battlefield series in general has been notoriously guilty of this when it comes to the scout not even making a lot of sense mechanically. When it comes to common sense, you think, yeah, why on earth would a sniper be, like, forward? That surely, with the range advantage, they'd want to be back. But more to the point, these scout and sniper classes, generally as a result, don't play the objective in the way that every other class does. So you end up in a situation where people are sitting on a hill being useless. They're simply trying to pick people off, but they're not going to the objective. They're not setting the charge. They're not defending people that are actually trying to win the game. And as a result, there's actually quite a lot of ire from the player base towards the scout class, and I think a lot of it is justified because it makes very little mechanical sense.
Interesting.
Now, in terms of the quality of scopes used, I assume scopes were just like not in, even to snipers, were not in any way standard issue from the military or anything like that. Like, how would a scope be acquired exactly if they were to be used?
A couple different things. Certainly some were standard issue. All the major powers had sniper schools, certainly by the end of the war. And they did have formal scopes, some more than others. The United States, for example, the U.S. military had a couple of very standardized scopes that were issued as specific sniper weapons. The British and the Germans kind of did the same thing, but because of they wanted a lot of scopes, relatively speaking, and they didn't have any to begin with. So what they tended to do was take commercially available models. So with the Germans in particular, you'll find a fairly wide range of different specific models of scopes that were used, although they all kind of fall into the same basic parameters. They're basically all 3 and 4 power scopes, fixed scopes. But you'll find a bunch of different manufacturers, and the adjustment knobs all look different because they're all made by different people.
Did a 10-time scope actually exist? Is that even remotely practical?
Yes, it absolutely existed. In fact, you'll find really high magnification scopes as far back as like the U.S. Civil War. What the trade-off, what allows you to have high magnification, though, is to have a very small field of view. So a lot of these things, if you have a 10-power scope, it's like looking through a drinking straw. The scopes that were actually used in World War I were typically 3 and 4 power, with the notable exception being the American Warner and Swayze, which was 5 or 6 power, depending on the model.
Now, we will move on to the Gewehr momentarily, but what I will say is that despite the power of the cartridge of this weapon, the only problem I really had with it was the weight. It weighs quite a lot relative to other guns that I've shot. A lot of it's made of wood, so that's probably got a lot to do with it. But shooting it and even cycling the bolt, I found to be incredibly easy. I was told by my instructor, because I was holding it to my left shoulder as opposed to my right, that I could have an issue with the bolt, because, of course, these weapons were not designed to be ambidextrous by default. And yet, I found it surprisingly simple to operate. And to me, if you were to go and shoot a gun for the first time, I actually might recommend a bolt action as a result of that. You get to shoot sort of at your own pace. You're not worried about all that sort of thing. The recoil comes out, okay, you take the punch to your shoulder, and then you got as much time as you want to cycle the bolt and prepare for another shot. It seems to encourage accuracy.
Yeah.
I actually found it incredibly enjoyable to shoot, in fact. It was a really fun gun.
One thing I will point out that was to your benefit was that you were shooting everything standing up. And a lot of beginners are tempted to shoot from a bench or maybe even lying down because it helps you hold the gun steadier. That also increases the felt recoil. When you're standing up...
Ah, really?
Yeah, if you're standing up and you hold the gun nice and tight into your shoulder, when it recoils, you and the gun will kind of rock back together. And that absorbs most of the energy. If you're shooting prone, especially, what happens is your body has a lot of friction on the ground and it's not going anywhere. And so instead, the gun just slams into your shoulder.
And it hurts.
So,
no doubt about that.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of people who will say that guns like these bolt-action rifles are punishing to shoot. And that, I think, is primarily because they shoot them from a bench or from the ground. Yeah. If you shoot them standing up, far more pleasant to shoot.
Yeah, I would agree. As a novice shooter, first time I ever shot a bolt action, I was afraid of it. And then once I'd shot the thing, I realized, actually, no, this isn't too bad at all. You shoot it enough, you'll probably get a little bruise, but it was a great shooting experience, actually. I'd highly recommend giving it a try. Thankfully, these weapons are still very ubiquitous, very easy to find. So you should be able to give it a shot. Now, moving on to a different bolt action, of course, the German-issued I believe the Gewehr Model 88.
Yes, Gewehr. This was actually a rear echelon weapon that was no longer the standard equipment by World War I. They'd replaced it with the model of 1898, which was pretty much in every way a better gun. But the 88's an interesting one. The 98 is a Mauser. The 88 was actually kind of developed by a commission. They took the magazine assembly from one gun and the barrel jacket from another and the bolt from another and slapped... what they tried to do is take the best available elements and put them together to make like a super rifle. And designs by committee like that don't typically work out well. And the Gewehr 88 is no exception. It worked, but the Mauser 98 was a far more popular and successful rifle.
Now, in terms of the practical differences between something like the Gewehr 88 and the Springfield 1903, what are the most obvious mechanical differences, and how does that affect the performance of the weapon?
To be honest, there are none. They're both bolt action. The Gewehr 88 here was originally fed by what's called a Mannlicher or an en-bloc clip, like an M1, where you had all 5 rounds in a metal clip and you stuffed the entire thing, clip and all, into the rifle. And in 1905, the Germans updated this and retrofitted the rifles so that they would use stripper clips like the standard Mauser 98s. And so at that point, instead, you take your clip with 5 rounds and you kind of line it up in the back of the action and you push the rounds into the cartridge and then you take the clip off and throw it away. And that's exactly how the Springfield works. The bolt has some mechanical differences. They're not actually interchangeable, but functionally exactly the same as the Springfield. And the sights on the Gewehr 88 are basically the same as what you would have had on a World War I pattern Springfield.
Now, they use different calibers, but is there a practical power difference between the two?
Nope, not really. 8mm is what the Germans were using, 8x57mm, and the US was using 30-06, which in metric terms would be 7.62 by 63mm. So the US cartridge was longer, but that didn't actually correspond to a substantial increase in power, just because both countries used different powder formulations and different bullet weights, and the two are really quite comparable cartridges.
Now, moving on to the very famous Lee Enfield Mark I, which I believe was from 1903, if I recall correctly.
There was a development process behind the Lee Enfield. The period of the 1900s to the 1910s, they were iterating it through to what you have here in your hand.
Yeah, and there are quite a few iterations. If you are confused as to whether or not this was used in Battlefield, look for the SMLE in the loadout. I believe the SMLE Mark III is the one that's represented in the game.
Correct, which is that's correct. That's the one that was actually in the war. That's short, magazine, Lee Enfield. Lee designed the bolt, Enfield designed the rifling. It has a magazine, and the rifle itself is short. As a side note, if you want to leave this in rather than cut it for length, the before this, a lot of countries had a long rifle for the infantry and a short rifle for the cavalry because it's unwieldy to be carrying around this long rifle on a horse. Mm-hmm. And what a lot of countries ended up doing around this period of World War I, and the British are a notable one, is they combined these two. And instead of having a long and a short, they kind of came up with a compromise middle length. And that's why the SMLE is called a short rifle. It's longer than a carbine, but it's shorter than the standard, its predecessor, the infantry rifle.
Good to know. There were a ludicrous number of these damn things built, like over 17 million. Why exactly was this weapon as popular as it was?
Well, it had a number of things going for it. It has a 10-round magazine instead of 5. It has a cock on closed action instead of a cock on opening action, which what that means is at some point when you're opening and closing the bolt, there is a firing pin spring, and you have to compress it so that when you pull the trigger, there's some energy behind the firing pin to actually fire. And on a typical Mauser, you compress that spring when you open the bolt. And on the Enfield, you compress the spring when you close the bolt. The practical difference here is on the Enfield, there's very little force required to open the bolt and then pull it back. And as you start to push the bolt forward, you can kind of get up some momentum with your hand, which then goes straight into compressing the spring and locking the bolt. So it is, in practical terms, it operates faster than a Mauser. With the Mauser, you have to start, the bolt is closed and locked, and it's not going anywhere, and you have to compress the spring while you're opening it, which takes more time. In a military sense, honestly, this wasn't really that big of a deal. I don't think it was something that was particularly important, because when you've got a lot of guys shooting, the idea of having one guy simply dumping ammo as fast as he possibly can isn't really militarily significant. That said, the British did use this to their advantage. They recognized going into World War I that they did not have the number of machine guns that they probably ought to, and that they had a relatively small army, and that a war was going to be defensive in nature for them, at least at the beginning. And so the British Expeditionary Force trained very heavily with their Lee Enfield rifles and got to the point that they were extremely skilled marksmen. They were a professional army. They weren't conscripts, at least not at first. And they were able to exploit the potential speed and the magazine size of these rifles to pretty great effect.
Now, on a very sort of personal, subjective opinion, this will probably get you into a lot of trouble. Between these 3 bolt actions, if you had to be stuck in a trench with one of them, which one would you choose?
Well, my favorite rifle from World War I would be the Model 1917 Enfield, which is not included in Battlefield 1, unfortunately. Between the 3 that you had a chance to shoot here, I would take the Springfield. The Enfield is a good gun. In my experience, I've always had trouble with them getting some sand in the action or dirt in the action and malfunctioning. There's some other more nerdy technical issues we could get into, but my choice would be the Springfield.
There you go. And that is by no means an official proclamation, so you can calm down the comments. Thank you very much.
Something I should point out, because otherwise someone will, is that the rear sight on this particular Enfield that you shot has been replaced with an aperture sight, which is not historically correct.
There you go. Yes, there are a couple of different modifications considering the age of these things as a direct result. We did not put an EOTech on it, so don't worry about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, moving on to possibly the most controversial weapon that we have right here, and there's the number of reasons for that. Now, as far as we know, this is an MP18, but it might be an MP28. We're not 100% certain one way or the other.
Honestly, the differences between them are very slim.
Yeah, very slim indeed. One of the big complaints that quite a few people have had about Battlefield 1 is the prevalence of submachine gun type weapons. And the MP18 is a weapon that did actually pop up towards the end of World War I. It was fielded to a very limited extent, I believe. Certainly nowhere near as popular or as ubiquitous as Battlefield 1 would have you believe, but it was there. It did exist.
Yes, it was definitely there. These were used primarily by German Sturmtruppen, so the trench raiding elite assault forces. They got the newest, best guns. Perhaps more importantly, they got double rations, which in 1918 in Germany was a really big deal. Probably more important than what gun you had was whether or not you actually had food, because that was a significant problem in Germany at the end of the war. Now, the biggest difference between what you're shooting here and what would have been used in World War I is the magazine. During World War I, they used 32-round drum magazines, which were actually originally developed for the artillery Luger pistol. And this the MP18/1 submachine gun used them because that was the magazine that was out there, that was available. They were being made and they were in people's hands. So that's what the gun was designed to use. However, these were ridiculously complicated, expensive, finicky, and unreliable magazines. And very quickly after the war, the guns were retrofitted to use box magazines like the one you have there.
Yeah, the gun, strangely enough, did not have a very long production cycle. It was produced, I believe, between 1918 and 1920, and then they actually stopped production on it.
Right. The Germans weren't allowed to manufacture a lot of different types of armaments after World War II. So what you see with these is the later dated ones are primarily guns that were made during the war and were then collected up and reissued out to police and other civil security forces. When they did that, they would re-date stamp them so that they could keep track of what guns were in the government inventory versus what ones might just be floating around on the private hands, which they wanted to avoid.
Now, there were some people that made the argument that simply because the fact that the MP18 didn't make much of an impact really at all on the First World War, that this affected military doctrine going into World War II, that the Americans in particular were not convinced of the usefulness of a submachine gun in a military setting. Do you think that that's true?
Yeah, I think it is. And the British as well. In the United States, we really had this tradition of marksmanship that, whether it was realistic or somewhat fantastical, definitely had a profound influence on U.S. military policy. And there weren't a lot of submachine guns. Same thing with England. England was forced to buy Thompson submachine guns from the U.S. at insanely high prices, upwards of $200 a piece in 1940, which was a crap ton of money, until they could get their own submachine guns into production. Because, it's kind of like heavy machine guns at the beginning of World War I were widely undervalued by the military establishment. Well, the same thing holds in World War II. The utility of submachine guns was widely undervalued.
Now, the MP18 in particular, I found to be very, very easy to shoot. And I don't believe they'd ever actually shot that particular model at the range that I was at. So they were very interested to see, one, if it even worked, which it did for a limited time. And
Mostly,
yeah. It's surprisingly, considering its age, and the fact that it is a somewhat unfamiliar design that's a bit difficult to maintain, because you don't get to play around with an MP18 all that often. But when it actually did fire, the effect of the recoil was negligible to me.
Right, that's because it's a ridiculously heavy gun, and it's especially a front-heavy gun. The metal shroud and jacket on that thing, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's something like a 10-pound submachine gun.
It is about that, I believe the standard was about 9.2 pounds. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on how much ammunition you've got, which kind of magazine you've got in it. It is a very heavy gun. Compared to any modern SMG, it is way, way, way heavier. And that results in a lot of that recoil sort of being absorbed by the weight of the thing.
Yep.
You end up kind of overcompensating because you don't want to droop when you're trying to aim it. And, of course, there's a bit of weird weight distribution because it had a side-mounted sticker box magazine, kind of coming out the side there. And the way that they recommended that I fire it was not in the same way that, say, the Sten would be fired. We didn't hold on to the magazine to do that.
Right.
So we didn't have the sort of side stabilization. I don't know if I actually hit anything with it, but I will say that I felt almost no recoil at all, and that is a big difference between the way that these weapons actually work and the way that they're portrayed in Battlefield 1, and that's very much for a balancing reason. The MP18 and the Automatico in particular, the amount of recoil that those guns have in the game is unrealistically high, and the reason for that is balance, because if you didn't, then you'd end up with a universally accepted weapon that was just better than everything else. So they threw artificial recoil in there to try and make them a bit less overly competitive with other guns.
Yep, that's not surprising to me. You mentioned the Italian submachine gun. There was one Italian submachine gun that did see service right at the very end of the war, and everything I found, it really is kind of a toss-up which actually got into the war first, the MP18 or the Italian, the OVP 1918s. neither one of them was used in particularly large numbers. The Germans are better recognized. I think they probably put the guns to a little bit better use doctrinally than the Italians did, but in both cases, we're talking very small numbers, not able to make any substantial impact on the outcome of the war.
Yeah, there were quite a few pieces of tech that you could argue, while they were very influential later on, didn't really make a huge amount of difference. I mean, tanks in particular certainly made more of an impact than submachine guns did.
I was just going to say the German tanks in Battlefield 1, I think playing through the single-player campaign, I think I killed more German tanks than were ever actually manufactured in total. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, if I recall, what's the name of it? It's the A8?
The A7V.
A7V, yes. Historically, the A7V, if I recall correctly, was only properly used in, I think it was only one actual tank versus tank battle that ever happened in World War I to start with, between A7Vs and something else. And they actually used more captured Mark IV and Mark V land ships than they actually used their own tanks.
Yeah, A7Vs, they only made about 20 of them in total.
Yes, so. That is absolutely true. And I think there was one tank versus tank battle at some point. But yeah, a lot of the tanks that the Germans used were just captured. They were either captured French tanks, and the light tank in particular, that is one that was used quite a lot, the little Renault tank.
Yeah, the FT-17. Those are cute and cool.
They are. Very, very nicely designed little thing. They built quite a few of them, actually. Far more than people might necessarily expect. There's a bunch of historical inaccuracies when it comes to the tanks in that game, particularly if you happen to be a marksman and you use the so-called K-bullet. That did exist, but if I recall correctly, the K-bullet only really worked against the first couple of marks of the land ship, and then the armor was too thick for it to do a damn thing.
That is actually something that I'm working on finding out. I'm going to actually be doing some shooting with a 1918 tank Gewehr.
Fantastic.
In a couple months, and we've got some original armor-piercing ammunition, and I'm working on digging up the hardness and composition specs of some of that British tank armor.
Yeah, that was changed a lot over I believe there were 5 main marks of the land ship, as it's referred to in the game. And in terms of armor thickness, they changed things dramatically. Mostly because they were adapting to what they met on the field.
Yeah. That armor-piercing bullet, by the way, does not cause anything to explode.
No, it does not. No.
It just goes through the armor.
Yep. Designed to cause a lot of metal fragmentation inside the thing, and that's not because it has a fragmentation element to the bullet. It's because it shredded through armor, and then bits of the armor ended up embedded in people's faces, which is also the reason why you will notice in Battlefield 1 a few other classes wearing a chainmail mask of sorts.
Yep.
That was designed to sort of deflect some of that hot shrapnel.
Yep. There was actually some experimentation, especially on the British side, I believe, with firing standard rifle rounds at tank armor, and if the armor was not perfectly hardened, if you ended up with armor that was a little too brittle, you could have a bullet that didn't actually penetrate, but it would cause flakes of metal to shear off on the inside and fly around the inside of the tank.
Yes, absolutely. And that was one way of dealing with it before they realized, oh, we're probably going to need a dedicated anti-tank weapon of some sort. And a lot of that's sort of one big disappointment that I have with Battlefield 1, is that they don't really show the improvisational tactics that were used very early on when tanks were first introduced, when people had no idea what the hell they were supposed to do against something like this.
Yeah. And they also don't really get across the point of just how incredibly miserable it would be to have been a tank crewman in World War I. That's one of the worst possible jobs I can think of.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were more often than not, some of these tank crews just had to simply wear gas masks, not because of incoming gas rounds, but because of just the fumes inside the thing.
Yep.
That's a good way of ruining your lungs, as to be part of a tank crew. Not to mention that they crammed a lot of people into some of these things. You know, these were not 1- to 2-man tanks. The land ship, I believe, was crewed by at least 5, I think, something along those lines.
The A7V, I believe, had a crew of 18.
Ridiculous. People thinking in Battlefield 1, wow, this has 6 gun emplacements. That's obscene. No.
No, really not.
Yeah, and they were designing a hell of a lot larger ones that just didn't happen to get into production as well. That was the kind of the doctrine: make it bigger, make it put more crew in it.
And they moved about as fast as you can walk.
Yes.
When they were moving at all, because I think they broke down more than they actually moved.
Yeah, the reliability of those tanks was not good at all. And it's also worth noting, of course, that Battlefield allows you, regardless of your faction, to use all of these tanks because there simply weren't enough tank classes to allow for sort of regional and national picks. But there was a lot of captured tank usage in World War I.
This is true.
So you can kind of get away with it there.
I particularly like the bit where you can get outside and bang a wrench on the hull for a couple seconds and fix it.
That'll do the job. Weirdly enough, the way that they do the internal repair stuff is far more accurate. In a lot of Battlefield games, you have to get out of the tank to repair it, and obviously that's the whole banging the wrench thing, which looks ridiculous. But you do have the option to do internal repair in Battlefield 1, and that was far more common.
Yeah, because usually what was going wrong was the engine was simply not running, and getting out would not help you in any way.
No, it wouldn't. No, you can't fix it from out of there. But yeah, hell, we could spend hours talking about the weirdness of the tank usage there. But when it comes back, back down to that SMG, the MP18 it's a nice gun. A little too heavy, but if I recall correctly, it had a lot of influence on future SMG design.
Yes, absolutely. It was kind of the standard bearer. In fact, the British would basically copy it for their Lanchester submachine gun and then simplify it for the Sten.
Not commonly used, but certainly very influential indeed. But as I said, bear in mind, nowhere near as much crazy nonsense recoil in terms of the real deal, if you ever get a chance to shoot one.
Definitely. One last thing I want to point out is you had a bunch of malfunctions with it.
We did.
Those are in part due to the gun being old, but they're also because this is a gun that is, because of its legal status, it's kind of put together from parts by Battlefield Vegas, which is not conducive to reliability, not reflective of what you would get with an actual factory production original gun. The magazines are a later version of magazine that was kind of retrofitted to use in that gun. A lot, and the fact that this is a rental range, I think we'll see it more in the next couple of machine guns. But it's not just that a gun's old, but when it's at a rental range, it has gone through innumerable different hands from people who aren't familiar with it, and it's extremely difficult to keep guns running reliably in that environment, no matter how good they were to begin with.
Yeah, and that's only multiplied by the age as well, because of course. There are not people that old that have real combat experience with these weapons more often than not, so they're learning on the fly as to how to keep these things maintained. So I want to make sure that people know it's not that Battlefield Vegas does not take care of its weapons. It's just it's very hard to keep a weapon like that as reliable as it should be, especially considering its age and a lack of real parts for it.
Right.
Although, I will say that, one of the guns that we are about to see ran incredibly well considering its age, and the other two maybe not so much. So, we can move on to one of the 3 light machine guns that we got to use right here. This is one that you are probably quite familiar with, and of course it goes by the name of the Vickers medium machine gun.
Yep, either medium or heavy, depending on when. In today's parlance, we'd call it a medium. In World War I, that was a heavy machine gun.
What are the practical differences between a sort of light, medium, and heavy machine gun in World War I terms?
Well, in World War I, there really wasn't a medium. Medium has come about after the development of 50 caliber machine guns that led you to have this, you needed an extra term. In World War I, a heavy machine gun was one that was basically emplaced, and you could not easily move it. So a Vickers with its mount and its ammo and its water is about a 100-pound package, and it requires a crew to operate, and you set it up, and it has a spot, and you fire it from there. The light machine guns were the guns which could be both carried and operated by a single guy. Guns like the Lewis or the Madsen, or sort of the 08-15, which we'll get to in a moment. That was the difference between light and heavy, was basically portability. And the Vickers would definitely have been a heavy at the time. I'm actually quite familiar with them because I have one sitting right next to me right now.
Always useful to have one talking about.
Yes. I went out and got it just for this show.
Great.
Okay,
I do wish I was in a position where I could do that. It's like, we'll just grab Vickers right over there. They're available in your local Walmart. About that. Now, this, I believe, was the commonly used machine gun for the British Army. It was, I believe, it kicked into service in 1912. It stuck around for a long time, actually.
Indeed it did, till the 1960s.
Yep, it was used in the Korean War, it was used in the South African border war, and all sorts of things like that. You would expect things to be replaced quicker than that, but This thing was very, very reliable. It had a reputation for that, if I recall correctly.
Yes, I would call the Vickers the best machine gun of its type ever made. There was an anecdote in the early 1960s when they were getting ready to get rid of these. When the British were transitioning from 303 to 308 NATO ammunition, they had, huge stockpiles of 303 that they didn't really have anything to do with. And there's a recorded anecdote from an armorer's school where they took a Vickers gun, pulled it all apart, ran it through all the tests and gauges to make sure it was in good functional condition, which it was. And then they proceeded to spend 7 days and nights with two-man crews swapping out, and they put 5 million rounds of ammunition through it, basically without stopping, except to refill the water and to change the barrels. And when they were done with that, they pulled the gun back apart, and it's still gauged as completely in spec.
It's ridiculous when I think about it. And that similar thing was also done in practical terms. In the actual real war, I believe the British 100th Company of Machine Gun Corps, they had 10 Vickers guns, and they fired it pretty much continuously for 12 hours. They went through 100 barrels, 1 million rounds, and didn't have a single failure.
Yep.
Which is an insane amount of reliability when you think about it. This gun was widely adopted by a lot of different countries. I believe we issued a few of them to the first US divisions that headed over to France, because they didn't have any.
Colt actually manufactured Vickers guns. So we had them here. They got used on aircraft. They were mounted on vehicles. It's interesting. I should point out the quality did not come easily. In today's dollars, a Vickers gun, each individual Vickers gun cost the British government about $10,000 in World War I.
That is a lot of money.
Translated into today's money. So, yeah, they were ridiculously expensive. The British made about 75,000 of these during World War I. You can imagine the cost investment in these guns, but it was worth it because they were simply that good.
They were unbelievably reliable. One of the several water-cooled weapons.
Right.
So people might wonder, why do the older machine guns look like that? Why do they have that bulbous barrel? Well, generally speaking, inside that, you've got water, and that's how they cooled the weapon to make sure it didn't melt down.
Exactly. That's what allowed you to fire continuously, was the barrel will get up to the boiling point of water, and then it'll just stay there until all the water is boiled off. And so as long as you occasionally refill the water jacket, the only thing that is actually really wearing on the gun is the rifling inside the barrel just from friction. And so these would have a barrel life of about 15,000 rounds, give or take. At that point, you have to replace the barrels. But with an air-cooled machine gun, you're talking about hundreds of rounds before you have to stop shooting and take care of the barrel instead of many thousands.
Now, we didn't stick with using this water cooling method. The doctrine change. Did that come down to weight? Was it an practicality issue with water?
Partly weight, and partly the development of mobile warfare meant that there just wasn't that much need to have a gun that could fire 10,000 rounds without stopping. If you're not trying to repel waves of enemy troops coming over the top, and of course the enemy troops discovered by the end of World War I that waves coming over the top into gunfire isn't a very practical way to.
Well,
didn't work so well. And so modern combat doctrine simply doesn't require that kind of sustained fire.
I believe you needed a team of up to 8 people for this thing, didn't you? And that was mostly as a result of the weight of it and carrying all the spare parts and ammunition and so on.
It's mostly ammunition. Actually, firing is typically 2 guys. You've got one guy who's taking care of the belt of ammo and reloading when the ammo runs out. These use 250 round belts. You've got one guy actually doing the firing. And then generally the rest of the crew is occupied in bringing ammunition. When you actually go to move the gun, you typically need 4 men to move it. You get one guy with the gun, one guy with the pintle, one guy with the tripod, and one guy with at least 2 cans of ammunition, so you have something.
Now, the Vickers is not, I believe, a weapon that is represented in Battlefield 1 as an infantry portable weapon. It's not
Correct.
On the light machine gun list. It is included as a mounted weapon, I think, and also a couple of the vehicles have it mounted on, which was common.
That's exactly how it should be. Yeah, you should not be able to grab this thing and run around firing it from the hip.
No. There's certainly a couple of guns where they did try that, but not this one.
In fact, the primary reason is this thing is fired by spade grips and a thumb trigger. So it doesn't matter how strong you are, you're not really holding this thing by the grips and shooting it. without the tripod.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to do that. And don't get me wrong, the thumb trigger is great. You know, nice little addition, very easy to shoot. But as soon as you took it off a mount, that would become nigh on impossible. So not ideal. Now moving on to a weapon that they decided actually, yeah, totally, you can fire this from the hip. The MG08/15.
Right. You sort of can fire it from the hip, kind of. It's heavy. I've done some shooting and moving. That whole package weighs 40 or 45 pounds when it's loaded up with ammo and a drum and water and all that. And it's pretty taxing to move that thing around and actually use it.
Yes. It is a bit of a nightmare. The 15, if I recall correctly, was designed to be a more portable version. Like, the other one was even worse.
Well, and it is a more portable version. So what the Germans had at the beginning of the war was the Maschinengewehr 08, the 1908 model, which was similar to the Vickers. The Vickers is a further evolution of the Maxim gun, which is the MG08 is a Maxim, the first successful commercial machine gun. Or commercial and military machine gun. And what they did with the 1915 variant here is, first off, they put a buttstock on it, and they put a pistol grip and a trigger, rather than the thumb triggers like the Vickers has. And then they cut some pieces away from the receiver, removing weight wherever they could. They made the side plates thinner. They made the jacket smaller, so it carries less water, which makes it lighter, and brought it down to a weight that is just barely effectively portable. And it did work as a light machine gun for the German military. Not so much in the way that you could, swing it around from the hip and mow down people, but that one guy could actually carry this thing and move from position to position. And so, you'd move up to a spot, set the gun down on its bipod, which you don't have here because they've got the pintle mounted in the range. But once you set that on a bipod, you could then support and provide covering fire for other guys in your unit who are then moving. And you could, say, cover some grenadiers while they moved up, and they could then throw some grenades into an enemy trench or position. And once other guys were in position, then the machine gunner could pick up the 0815 and relocate it to a better position.
Now, the use of this thing in Battlefield 1 is perhaps one of the most egregiously silly ways of using it. It is a weapon that is used as part of the Sentry Elite class. And you may, I believe, if I recall correctly, and you've played this level, so you know how silly it is.
Yeah.
This is the same gun that was used in the I Am Iron Man level, where you're running up a mountain, murdering an entire army, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And that is silly for a huge number of reasons, not least of which the amount of ammunition you're carrying in the damn thing, how fast you're moving. I mean, you would get tired within minutes, surely, trying to do something like that.
Yes, and you would hit nothing in the process.
Yeah. It is complete nonsense in that particular respect, and pretty much all of the use of LMGs in Battlefield 1 is nonsense, including the fact that they do include some lower weight variants that have less ammunition that sort of improve the handling a little bit, but even then, with like a lower weight variant for a Lewis gun or something like that, you would not have seen that strategy used because it just wouldn't work.
Also, that sort of lower weight variant has no historical reality.
Really? Interesting
to know.
There weren't
differences. No, there was just... No, you had the Lewis gun, and then you also had Lewis guns for aircraft, where they would do things like take off the air cooling jacket, because you don't need it when you're flying around in an airplane, and maybe take the buttstock off and replace it with just a single spade grip. But those guns were put on airplanes. You didn't have them in the field because with a spade grip and no cooling jacket, they're not particularly useful in an infantry role.
No, that is pretty nonsensical. Now, I should point out the footage you've seen in the background. This MG0815 has not been fully restored as of yet, so as you will notice, there are a bunch of mechanical problems with it. They are still working on it. This is not a gun that you can go and shoot if you ask them. It's not on the price list, because they ain't done with it. But we wanted to try it out anyway as a result. So if you like to see a lot of tinkering and also brass gets stuck in places brass should not be, then there's plenty of that. But that is not indicative of how reliable the actual weapon was in combat, though, right?
Correct. The reason they're having issues here is that original German Maxim belts they're made of cloth. So after 100+ years, they're very fragile, and they're also very expensive. And what they are using here are a different type of metallic belt The feed block in the gun is not designed to work with that belt, so they have to pull the belt through manually while you're firing. And if you get just a little too much tension on it or just a little too little tension on it, it will malfunction, which it does several times here.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's clearly it's a work in progress for them.
It absolutely
Originally,
is,
these guns would have been quite reliable.
Now, moving on to one of our final weapons. And here's one that this model is incredibly reliable on the range. And this is, of course, the one and only Lewis gun. You can probably immediately tell if you play Battlefield 1 based on that very unusual magazine on the top there.
Yeah, Lewis guns are awesome.
This one actually took a bullet. It saw service. You may have noticed the kind of weird... It's like, what's going on with the barrel there? There's a dent in that because it took an actual round. I believe, and I may... I can't remember if this... the way that it's set up right now certainly doesn't indicate that, but it may have been mounted on aircraft.
It does have the aircraft rear grip on it, yes. Although, if it had been on an aircraft, it wouldn't have this big, heavy jacket around the barrel. Mm-hmm. If you look, it kind of looks like the water-cooled guns with that large diameter thing. What was really interesting about the Lewis is Lewis came up with this idea of he put an aluminum finned radiator around the barrel. So the actual barrel on this is just like a rifle barrel in size. Yeah. And then you've got this big steel shell over that. And it's set up so that the muzzle blast with each shot pulls air through this big tube over this aluminum radiator. And the idea is that you're getting forced airflow and thus improving the cooling of the gun without needing a water jacket.
Very interesting indeed.
And it's how effective that is, I'm not entirely sure. It would be fun to try and do some quasi-scientific tests on it, but that's not something that I've had the opportunity to do. But when they use those on aircraft, that's just extra weight.
Yes.
Because if you're flying around a couple thousand feet up going 60 or 70 or 80 miles an hour, you don't need that. You've got plenty of airflow over the gun as it is.
You absolutely do. Now, talking about reliability, this thing, they've done a great job restoring this. They've been working on this, I know, for a number of years. They had the same gun 3 years ago that they were restoring at the time. They've put a lot of love and care and attention into it because it did see service and it still has the battle damage to prove it. That, this was a gun that was used to great effect, and we burned through a whole magazine with this, no problem at all. They had a lot of fun loading that magazine. Can you explain that particular magazine design? Like, what was the purpose of the big disc on the top there?
Well, what you've got is cartridges that are all pointing towards the very center of that drum. And you've got 2 or 3 layers in there. And there's kind of a spiral of cartridges inside. And it was simply a way to get a large amount of ammunition without having the magazine protrude too much in any particular direction. So this holds 47 rounds. If you had a 47 round box magazine coming out the bottom, it would get in the way of trying to, lay the gun down close to the ground. If you had it coming out of the top, it would be awkward. If it were coming out of the side, it would be very side heavy. And the idea of using a pan like this, at the time was kind of this, well,
why not?
This seems like a good idea. Yeah. And the Lewis guns also lasted in British service for quite a long time. What's kind of neat about this is these magazines have no springs in them at all. They sit on a center peg in the gun, and that peg rotates as the gun fires.
You'd think that would did that make the magazine more reliable because it didn't have that? Or?
Possibly. It was certainly one less thing to go wrong. But yeah, the action of the gun cycling forced the magazine to rotate one cartridge per iteration. So in fact, you can see it doing that during the firing. You can see that drum slowly spinning.
Now, despite its rather unusual look, did this weapon have significant influence on future designs? Sort
of. It influenced a couple specific guns. I would say it influenced the idea of a light machine gun. Insofar as it showed people that this could be a very valuable type of firearm to have and that we should go out and design better ones. Mechanically, it's kind of interesting. Mechanically, the Lewis gun is the direct predecessor to the FG-42, the German automatic paratroop rifle. I don't know if you're familiar with those. Oh, yes,
yeah. That popped up a couple of times. Wolfenstein, I believe, is a game that included that one.
And then the FG-42 is pretty much the direct predecessor to the US M60. So the M60's mechanics are very similar to the Lewis guns. But that's pretty much all that it directly influenced. Not really anything else.
Great gun to shoot, though. Had a lot of fun with it, and it was nice to see it reliable. You know, the range was very excited that we unloaded the whole thing without having a single problem with it. It sounds great. It feels great. Obviously, it has a tendency to try and walk up a little bit, but that's a machine gun. It's going to do that, especially on a pintle. We had a lot of fun shooting that thing.
These are fantastic steampunk guns.
They really
There's just
are,
so much going on. You got bolt handles flying back and forth, brass coming out the side, smoke puffing out, the drum rotating. They're a hoot to play with.
Great gun. Now, last but by no means least, the gun that I had the most problem with, which not in terms of its reliability, but in terms of actually handling the thing, the Browning Automatic Rifle, or BAR. Now, there were a couple of versions of this. The 1918 version was used in World War I. The one we have here is not a 1918 version, if I recall correctly.
Right. It is a 1918 A2. It is the American military World War II version of the BAR.
What were the practical differences between those?
The most significant one is in World War I, they didn't have a bipod on it. They also had... this is a little more esoteric, but in World War I, they had semi-auto and full auto. And in World War II, they actually had only full auto, but you could choose between a slow rate of fire and a fast rate of fire.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I haven't heard of many guns that do that.
No, there are not very many. And it is interesting. It's just not particularly useful.
Why do you think it wasn't included in other gun designs? I guess like a novice would think, oh, being able to select like rate of fire seems kind of handy. Why is that not the case?
Well, because it's actually not all that handy. I totally understand why it seems that way, but in practicality, you're better off learning how to use the gun with a specific rate of fire and then using it rather than trying to think about, well, oh, do I want fast or slow now? No, just leave it as normal.
Leave it as it is, as it was designed to.
Yeah, really, the two things that you might want are full auto and just semi-automatic. Mm-hmm. And if you have a relatively low rate of fire, it's actually quite easy to just fire single shots when you want to. So I can see the justification for guns that have a relatively high rate of fire having a semi-auto mode. But the idea of a fast and a slow, and in the case of the BAR, it was fast was about 600 rounds a minute and slow was 350 or 400 rounds a minute. And there isn't that much difference between the two. That said, the really practical difference was that the World War I gun had no bipod. And it was intended to be a rifle that you would fire from the shoulder or fire from the hip while moving.
Yeah, that's the interesting part, because a lot of people would think, well, it's ridiculous in, say, Battlefield 1 to see people walking around with these things. This is the one case where that is not actually true. These were designed for that, as bizarre as that sounds, especially considering how much they weigh, and they were designed around a doctrine called walking fire, if I recall correctly. Right.
The notion was you could get a bunch of guys with automatic rifles like this one, firing from the hip as they advanced across no man's land, and they could put down a suppressing fire which would prevent the enemy from effectively shooting back until they reached the enemy trench. In practicality, if you try this, what actually happens is the guy who's walking doesn't hit anything, and the German on the other side is, sitting in a pillbox basically with a belt-fed Maxim gun, and he just wipes out everyone who's coming over the top. It didn't really get used that way very much.
If you were going to have a real-world version of that silly level in Battlefield 1 and the armor up the mountain, you'd probably do it with this, not with an MG 1508. Despite the fact that it did not work that way at all. It did end up being used in World War I, and I believe there was a lot of interest from the French in acquiring them to replace their machine guns at the time. What was it? The Shao-Shat?
The Shao-Shat.
Yeah,
Shao-Shat. Yeah. It was the other way around, actually. The U.S. primarily used French Shao-Shat automatic rifles because the BAR was introduced quite late. And when it was first introduced, American commanders made the decision to hold them back and wait until they could launch a full-scale offensive with a lot of them, rather than kind of trickle them out one at a time as soon as they came over from the U.S. They were concerned that the Germans would capture one very early, which is legit, and that the Germans would then be able to quickly basically replicate and develop a similar gun of their own, thus the U.S. would lose the surprise advantage of a potential devastating new weapon. And there's some legitimacy to that. In the end, they were introduced close enough to the end of the war that I'm not sure it really would have made much difference either way. The French Chauchat was used had the same basic doctrine of walking fire originally, and then also kind of was a pioneer of light machine gun tactics, because guys very quickly discovered that if you're holding this thing at the hip and firing, the idea was that you would fire one shot with each left step or each right step. So you had this very slow cadence of continuous fire as you moved, which wasn't actually practical. And so the guys who had these guns learned the hard way what kind of tactics would work. So you would see things teams of automatic riflemen setting up strong points to pin an enemy in place, not necessarily trying to hit them, but preventing them from moving or doing anything. And then you could get some guys with hand grenades or rifle grenades to flank around the side and destroy the position. That's how these guns were actually used effectively in combat.
Yeah, and the one major battle they were used in, I believe, was the Mauser offensive. You did mention that they saved a bunch of them up to deploy them all at once to make sure that they made an impact. They made such an impression that we had a weird sort of reversal of situation where if once the US came over, a lot of them were issued sort of surplus French weapon initially.
Yep.
And then at the end of that battle, apparently France requested 15,000 BARs to replace the Chauchat because they were impressed by its use in that particular battle. So it ended up being a weird, hey, we used your guns and now we'd really like, it to be the other way around situation.
Yeah. Yep, the BAR is definitely a better gun than the Chauchat. Chauchat is not nearly as bad as its reputation would make it out to be, but it's kind of like the Sten of light machine guns. They were designed to be made very quickly, very cheaply, and cranked out. The Chauchat was, in fact, the most heavily produced machine gun of the entire war.
Yep, of 250,000 of those manufactured. They were not produced all that much after the war. I believe that if I was doing a little bit of research into this because I was interested, well, why is this weapon not included in Battlefield 1? Well, a lot of it probably has to do with the fact that they didn't actually cover the French forces very well in the base game, and that's coming in an expansion pack later, so we might see that gun at that point, but that the main weakness being a sort of fiddly and very unreliable magazine, if I recall correctly, that was very easily affected by dirt and environmental issues.
Yeah, there's a big hole cut in the side of the magazine.
Oh, well, that was there.
Well, and the thing is, it was there for a reason. These guns were deployed as two-man teams. You had a gunner and an assistant gunner, and the assistant gunner's job was to do the reloading. So the hole in the magazine is there so that he can maintain an eye on how much ammo is left, and they don't have to have the gun go click and the gunner go, I'm out, and then the assistant gunner starts fishing around for a new magazine. It allows him to keep the gun topped up more quickly, but at the same time, it's this wide open space for anything to get in and foul the magazine in its spring. So why they didn't, it's kind of surprising to me that they never managed to come up with just a better magazine design, which would have solved a lot of the gun's shortcomings, but they never did. A number of countries did use them after the war. The Germans actually did use captured ones, and to some extent, they even converted them to 8mm Mauser to continue using them during the war, but generally regarded as the worst light machine gun ever.
Yes, yeah, there were a few writers that believe that is true when it comes to war usage, no doubt. When it came to the BAR, obviously it was used quite a lot in World War II as an updated model, but when it came to firing the thing, this was the most difficult of all the weapons that I had to fire, and you explained a couple of reasons to why that may very well be. This was, of course, the only gun that we fired on a bipod. We had the LMGs mounted to pintles, which makes them a lot easier to handle. This thing kicks. This thing has a big, big bullet, and it really wanted to escape. It was wandering backwards very quickly. I could only fire it in a few round bursts, because otherwise it would have literally knocked me over at that point. It was sending me backwards.
Yep. I think you were getting the true light machine gun experience.
Indeed.
They have a lot of recoil to them, and it takes some practice to be able to shoot them effectively and control them. Now, the fact that you have a slick-bottomed bipod there on a relatively slick table surface didn't help you at all.
Not really. You can't really embed these into the ground and the dirt and allow that to happen. But you were mentioning earlier, I think with the bolt action, that some people that first try a bolt action will try it sort of lying down and they feel the recoil is worse. What would have actually happened if I'd shouldered this thing?
It would have gone up and pushed you back.
Would it have been worse than what I had there? Or would it simply have been a case of I'm just too novice a shooter, I would have not been able to handle this regardless of what I did with it?
I think you would have put a lot of holes into the ceiling. The effective way to shoot this would have been to lie down.
Right.
Because in that case, a lot of the recoil does get absorbed by the weight of the gun. And when you're lying down, it's not going to climb on you. The bipod feet are going to stay firmly in the ground, and that gives you much better control over the gun.
Now, one question I hear about the BAR is that it's like, right, this is it's an automatic rifle that sort of has a crossover with a light machine gun and maybe doesn't do either job massively well. It has a 20-round box magazine. Mm-hmm. And you might think, well, okay, well, if it's an automatic weapon, I'm supposed to be laying down suppressing fire. What the hell uses a 20-round box magazine? Like, what was the design philosophy behind that?
Largely, it was based on an automatic rifle design where 20 rounds was acceptable because you were firing rather slowly. The U.S. really did not have a light machine gun in World War II, and the BAR was pressed into service as a pseudo-light machine gun.
Right.
And the magazine capacity is, as you point out, one of its limiting factors. Now, in general, 30 was the standard, and so 20 is not that much worse than 30, but it certainly requires some fire discipline. You just can't hose things down with the BAR, which in some ways is good because the BAR does not have a particularly heavy barrel as machine guns go. It doesn't have any cooling fins on the barrel. It really doesn't have anything to improve heat management of the gun. In fact, I had a friend who was an armorer in Korea when the U.S. still didn't have a light machine gun and didn't have all that many mounted machine guns in service in general. And he absolutely despised the BAR because guys would force them into the supporting machine gun role and dump magazine after magazine after magazine through them, burn out the barrels, and then they can only be changed by an armorer with a big wrench and a specialty set of tools. And my buddy ended up doing an awful lot of that work and hated the gun as a result.
I have to say I was not a huge fan of it. It was fun to shoot maybe, but I'm just very glad that I would have never had to use the bloody thing, because it's a strange gun in terms of its design, no doubt about it. But it is a piece of history, and it was adopted in massive numbers across many wars, including, of course, World War II, and was still in service with the US until the 70s, if I recall correctly. Yep.
Yeah, very little use in World War I just because it was introduced too late in the war.
Just that one battle.
Very, very much like the submachine guns.
So there you go. But, of course, weapon variety is king when it comes to something like Battlefield 1, and you can play around with the BAR in Battlefield 1. You'll probably have a hell of a lot more luck with it than I did, especially if you happen to be using a bipod on it. I think it does have bipod in yet in World War I. It didn't, did it? That was just a feature of the
Correct.
A2. So
yeah, they put bipods on a bunch of things that shouldn't have had them. In the game.
Yeah, I think that people have an expectation that these weapons did have bipods, and no, actually not back then. There we go, folks. Lots and lots of gun information for you. I'd love to have gone through all of the weapons that Battlefield 1 has, but one, that would take all day, and secondly, a lot of them are very hard to find these days. But there are an awful lot more of them over on Ian's channel.
I, in fact, have an entire playlist specifically of World War I guns that are in Battlefield 1. So a lot of information there for people who are interested. You can take a look at.
Absolutely.
Videos on the Cherogati, the Mondragon, all sorts of weird stuff that showed up in the game.
Calibri?
Yep.
It's there.
The only video on the Calibri out there. The world's tiniest little useless pistol.
Indeed. Well, there's one that's accurately represented in BF1 as being bloody useless. But there you go. Check out the channel for Ian's work over at youtube.com/ForgottenWeapons. And of course, he has a website, ForgottenWeapons.com. If you find a lot of stuff there that's similar to Battlefield 1, that's probably because DICE nicked it.
I think so.
Probably the biggest resource, I think, for guns like that on the internet right now.
I would like to think so.
Ian, thank you very much for spending so much time today and explaining to a novice how a lot of this stuff works. Very much appreciated. Hopefully we'll get to work together at some point in the future. Maybe find a game that is a little bit less unrealistic.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate being on. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. And thanks for watching, folks. Big thanks, of course, to Battlefield Vegas. They allowed us to shoot all of these guns. We had a great time with them. Their staff and their instructors are extremely professional. It's a very friendly place to go. If you happen to be in Vegas and you have no gun experience, these guys are maybe the best people to go to because they're very understanding of that. They're, of course, extremely respectful of the firearms. They teach you proper safety and all that sort of thing. It's a great place to shoot. It's very enjoyable. They also have a huge selection of weapons to try out and several packages designed around video games. There's a whole CSGO package where you could shoot almost everything from Counter-Strike Global Offensive as well as a bunch of other games. So do give it a try. You know, it's great to, at least once in your life, get your hands on some of these weapons and sort of learn a new respect for them because they are represented in games in a often unrealistic and flamboyant fashion. So it's nice to get your hands on them in a real way and learn what they're really supposed to handle like. Big thanks to Jenna for doing all of the great filming and standing behind a lot of very loud weapons that I was probably not handling correctly. And big thanks to the staff, Nick in particular, who spent a lot of time fixing this stuff that wasn't working correctly. Again, it is all, this stuff's over 100 years old. It is to be expected. Big thanks to Jonathan as well, who was doing a lot of the modeling for the heavier machine guns, proving you can at least carry them. You can carry them. Whether or not you can shoot them at the same time, that's a different matter entirely. Thanks a lot for watching, folks. If you enjoyed the video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And do check out Battlefield Vegas over at battlefieldvegas.com. I'll see you next time.